Hello everyone, David Kotzman is my name. I work at the Jožef Stefan Institute, Department of Environmental Sciences in Ljubljana, Slovenia. And what I am presenting today is a very short overview on the use of the sensor-based technologies for personal exposure assessment, which of course is a very important component of our URBANOME project as well. What I'm presenting is basically based on my personal and the experience of the consortium from various international projects, which are covering very different aspects, all the way from the testing of sensing tools, their use for the exposure assessment, integration in the Earth observation applications, environmental epidemiology, and all the way to their use in the city-scale personal interventions, which is the topic of the URBANOME. When we speak about the real-life applications, there are very different aspects that should be considered. For instance, the technical aspects of the sensing technologies, citizen science aspects and the related issues, given that the final users are usually the lay people involved, then various data management and related ancillary infrastructures issues, including environmental modeling, if I just name a few of them. Because we are very limited with the time today, I will focus on an aspect which, in my potentially biased view, is one of the most important ones. Namely, we should always take into account that in applications of sensors, we are dealing with at least two main parties involved: researchers on one side and citizens on the other. Now, while researchers are usually focused on the community level aspects, citizens are more interested usually in their personal individual level outcomes. So the roles of both groups, their levels of involvement, perspectives, and so on can be quite different. And this is very important to consider in real life applications of sensing technologies. There are, for example, very different rationales for researchers and the citizens to participate in studies to start with. Usually, for researchers, inclusion of people means, among others, performing more socially relevant research, fostering interpretation of problems and the results, and strengthening of the dissemination of the findings. Then, on the other hand, lay participants might participate because, for instance, they would simply like to sense the community, or they would like to enhance their scientific literacy, or, for example, they would like to advocate for some changes to happen. And again, this is another thing that should be considered in applications. Next, also the actual involvement or the level of involvement of the citizens can vary a lot, all the way from a relative passive crowdsourcing and participation in data gathering, all the way to very active engagement in, for example, formulation of the study design, data analyzing, and even disseminating of the results. On the other hand, researchers talk about the change of the paradigm of environmental monitoring, and they are usually very excited how we can increase the spatio-temporal resolution of our observations and how we can make our observations more personal. When we are reading the related literature, we can see that there is still an ongoing debate about reliability of new sensing technologies and accuracies versus the so-called fitness for purpose aspects. Basically, how we have to define for what kind of purpose an individual device can and should be used. This is a very important aspect to have this knowledge. Within the URBANOME project, we performed an extensive review of the literature about applicability of sensing technologies for addressing different urban stressors with the help of the mostly wearable sensors. Our focus was on the actual real-world applications, and we investigated different aspects such as which stakeholders are involved, what are usually domains of interest, how complex the studies are, what is the level of involvement of different stakeholders, including ethical and the intellectual property implications. And really, very briefly, what we can see is that, of course, there is an increase of respective publications that can be seen from year to year, with studies that are being conducted mostly in the developed parts of the world. And nowadays, the trend is that both outdoor and indoor environments are being considered in these studies in the recent years. Regarding the involvement of different stakeholders, participants, we can see from this reviewed literature that these people are mostly involved in the crowdsourcing type of applications, which are usually or mostly related to air quality studies, and that participants hardly ever receive, or it's at least reported that they receive any feedback about their involvement. And very similar, the intellectual property issues are hardly ever mentioned in the literature. Now in the following slides, I'm showing some examples and differences in roles, interests, benefits of volunteers in the studies on one side and researchers on the other. For example, volunteers that are wearing sensors, they benefit from seeing their individual level exposure data in real time or retrospectively. And at the same time, they can be very valuable because they can provide their feedback on the user experience of participation. On the other hand, for the researchers, of course, it is more exciting to play with the raw data and use such data for air quality models validation, for example, as shown on these two figures here. Another example is from the Icarus projects, where participants, in addition to wearing and hosting different sensors, they were very busy providing very detailed information on the characteristics of their home, their living habits, and the time activity patterns. For the researchers, on the other hand, the main challenge in the data collection phase was coordination of distribution of hundreds and hundreds of sensors, then communication with the participants, and having control over very heterogeneous data streams and other many different technical challenges we were facing. In such an example, participants they benefit because they can get a very detailed insight into their personal exposure patterns. On the other hand, researchers we get very valuable information for studying community level patterns in the light of the activity and the characteristics of the specific microenvironments participants spend time in. Very similar, individuals can get insight into the spatio-temporal patterns, and researchers, on the other hand, can use such an information for the validation of spatially resolved exposure models, for example, as shown on this picture on the right-hand side. As I stressed before, it is very important to study motivation, user experience, and some potential behavioral change of the participants so that we can make some necessary improvements in our future projects and we can all benefit and learn something out of it. And very much along these lines, providing data to participants is very important and crucial aspect as well. And approaches such as user-centered design can be used to actively involve participants also in the co-creation of the study outcomes as well as in data analyzing phase. And nowadays there is a lot of different interactive online tools that are available for such purposes. And the same goes for handling huge amounts and heterogeneity of data that are streaming from different devices that are usually used. Because having control over this big data is crucial. And nowadays, modern tools and approaches for the automatization of the processes can be used for the efficient management as well as evaluation of the data gathered. And in our experience, this can be quite challenging and time consuming. In summary, very briefly, within the URBANOME project, we are proposing a general conceptual methodological framework, the idea of which is the efficient use of the sensing technologies and steps and issues that have to be considered in the following 6 steps, emphasizing basically based on our current knowledge and understanding what we should be careful about in real-life applications. First, in the so-called planning phase, it should be carefully considered who the stakeholders and end beneficiaries are and how we will actively involve them in our research. Then, for their effective engagement, we have to comprehend their needs and motivations. And in the design phase, we have to select tools that are fit for purpose. And in this phase, we have to consider the perspective of both the researchers and the lay people involved. In the fourth, the data collection phase, it is important to manage expectations of all the parties involved and to clearly define also the data governance and ownership issues very much since the beginning of the project. Then in the project outcome, the data evaluation phase, involvement of all the stakeholders to the fullest extent possible is of paramount importance. And lastly, in the final so-called demonstration phase, the tangible outcomes can be used as an important indicator on how well the research can provide some wider uses in the planning, the policy making, exposure reduction, and other related aspects our research is after. With this, I will thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to answer any potential questions you might have. Thank you.